For the Irish Freedom Party, the protection of our rights of freedom of speech are an absolutely non-negotiable core value. It is the reason why our party was established. And as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of our struggle for Irish freedom, it is sad to note that the great majority of our political parties are now united in an effort to take away the liberties and the rights for which our state was established to give us. The lockdown should be a wake-up call for all of us and of what government can do. And the proposed hate crime legislation, of which I shall speak shortly, is a direct attack against the principles of our Constitution. In any society which values liberty, freedom of speech is the primary freedom, because without that freedom, no other freedom can be protected or vindicated or defended. This has been recognised in every historical epoch, and in ancient Athens, freedom of speech was regarded as so essential that the Athenian lawmaker Solon made it a crime for any person not to engage in a public controversy. In the Ireland of today, our government is now attempting to make it a crime for anybody to engage in a public controversy. And we must ask, as a free people, given our long history of oppression, this is not something we are going to accept. And I'm here to tell you this is not something which the Irish Freedom Party will ever accept without a fight. Our political parties and our political system now seem to be more obsessed with what people say and how they express their opinions than they are in dealing with the real problems faced by people, the difficulties in housing, the difficulties in employment, the difficulties of putting food on their table. They seem to have an obsession with attacking not just how we say it, but even how we say it. In the words of the Austrian philosopher Wittgenstein, our culture has become bewitched by language, and perfectly innocent people who use the wrong expression in public can have their careers ended and their lives destroyed. We have seen the careers of some of our finest thinkers and our finest journalists ended in this fashion, and it is time for us to say this has got to stop. If our government can attempt to control our language, then it can exert ultimate control over its people. This obsession with total control is well illustrated in the present lockdown, and unless we act now, it will be a terrible presentiment of what may be coming down the tracks. One example of what is coming down the tracks and what is here at present is the proposed hate crime legislation. This proposed bill, which is currently before the Dáil at the behest of one of the main government parties, is the first element in legislation in development for over 2 years. It introduces for the first time into our society the twin concepts of hate crime and hate speech. I don't think I'm alone in thinking that when you start using those terms in the context of legislation, it brings us directly into the horrible world described by George Orwell in his novel 1984. When hate crime comes in the door, can thought crime be far behind? I don't think so. The stuff that only a few years ago was part of a dreaded science fiction nightmare world is now becoming a reality before our eyes. And unless we stop it, it will destroy the dignity and freedom of all of us. Orwell well warned us that when an idea can no longer be spoken or expressed, it very quickly becomes an idea which can no longer even be thought. So we are here not just to defend freedom of speech, we are here to defend freedom of thought and our rights and dignity as human beings. I am here to say that we will never let them take our human dignity without a fight of the most determined and bitter kind. The current bill before the Oireachtas has at least two elements that should fill us all with dread. It defines hate crime as any crime which is perceived by the receiving party as having been motivated by hate. Now just think about that for a moment. It is reliant on purely subjective criteria, and such a criterion should have no place in any just law. What burden of proof will be required? None. This is clearly a blackmailer's charter and a liar's license. It has the potential to bring the entire legal process into disrepute and will inevitably cause dissension between the disparate elements of society rather than, as it claims, promoting harmony between them. The proposed legislation will introduce a two-tier system of law with a very restricted group of designated victim classes being empowered to use the legislation to attack and suppress the free speech rights of the great bulk of the population. This can only have the effect of increasing racial and social tensions. Can we not see that the kinds of social division and violence that we have seen playing out in America's streets over the past 12 months are a salutary warning to us of what may arrive here if our politicians continue to stoke the fires of racial division and gender hatred? And if you want to know where equality legislation tends to end up, I can assure you it does not end up in equality. And an example of that is the employment equality legislation, which was introduced some years ago and may have had a short-term need. It has now resulted in a situation where employers are terrified of giving employment to anybody other than a victim group. Young men, and particularly young unskilled men, have been particular victims of this, and frequently don't, in the context of the public sector, don't even bother going for promotion because they know it will not be open to them. The government legislation sets out a confusing series of victim classes based on race, religion, and, you've guessed it, a long list of terms relating to human sexuality, including transgender, sexual orientation, sexual characteristics, and gender identity. We already know that this is a veritable minefield, but when they start getting into definitions, it opens up a Pandora's box for the legal profession. For example, it makes the first legal effort to define the word homophobia. Now, I'm utterly opposed to any unjust discrimination against homosexual persons, and their rights and dignity must always be protected. However, the definition of the legislation of homophobia is, quote, that of having negative and uninformed feelings towards homosexuality, not, mind you, to homosexual people. Having negative feelings will now be used to justify increased criminal sanctions. Can we not see the situation where a parent is concerned about their children being exposed to homosexual propaganda, as we see so often in our schools, and expresses a negative feeling to this? He has the potential to face prosecution for an aggravated crime in a situation of conflict. The potential for undermining religious freedom is very obvious, and we must ask at this stage, is it not intentional? You can call these developments what you like, but please do not call them progress, because they're not. An Garda Síochána, to whom this party has always expressed its gratitude for their professionalism, are going to be put in a situation of prosecuting people, not for criminal acts, but for holding the wrong opinions. This will always happen in a society which is losing control of serious crime, that the police are made to concentrate on made-up crimes of a spurious nature rather than dealing with real issues. We must question whether the role of the Gardaí is going to be dramatically changed and whether its members will be forced to become the political arm of an emergent police state with all the odious and loathsome apparatus of state that involves, and for which the lockdown may well be a dry run. We need An Garda Síochána to be just that, guardians of the peace and not enforcers of an intolerant moral code of political correctness. The lockdown may have served as a salutary warning of what the so-called new normal will constitute, but we must make it clear that we will not have a new normal, that we will not accept the destruction of our society and the destruction of what have been and are normal and acceptable behaviours. In the old Soviet system, gone and not lamented, governments which sought to tyrannise people always recognised the importance of separating people from their history, their culture and their religious identity, and the need to destroy those elements of an historic nation. Can we not now see the same forces at play in the Ireland of today, as indeed through all the states of the undemocratic European Union? A people without a culture, without an identity, and without connection to their religious roots will be less able to resist the tyranny of government. The left has always understood this, and this is why they have concentrated on the denigration of Irish national culture over the last 3 decades. We must let them know that we are proud of our culture, we are proud of our history, and we are proud of our roots, and we will never let tyranny destroy those values. In many ways, this is why the proposed hate speech legislation concentrates to some extent on racial matters. Couple this with the Agenda 2040, whereby government proposes the mass importation of up to 1 million persons into this country without any social or economic justification, and it becomes increasingly clear that Irish people will not be able to maintain any form of national identity into the future. Those who question Agenda 2040 or who question birthright citizenship or mass immigration are immediately classified as racists, xenophobes or worse. We must proudly proclaim that seeking to protect our nation from social and economic disruption is not a racist value but a patriotic one. The second main strand of attacks against free speech today indirectly comes from mainstream media and the high-tech companies who manipulate news and have become propagandists rather than journalists. If you want an example of that, look at the central role which big media and big tech played in the cynical and blatant rigging of the recent American elections and how our own media outlets have covered for them. The massive electoral fraud which has been uncovered and which is being uncovered makes you wonder why our government spent so much money some years ago in trying to implement an automatic voting system for our elections. The American experience is a warning that we must ever be vigilant of government as to try to corrupt the most central elements of our democratic process. I just had a bad thought. I had figured out a way of driving the Irish Times nuts. Let's give a great cheer from Dublin to Washington for President Donald J. Trump. Hang in there, and you will make it. I'll bask in the reflected glory for it. Our politics and our culture have fallen prey to a set of evil ideologies. Most of our politicians seem unaware of the consequences of what they are doing and simply respond to media pressure and to the orders they receive from their masters in the European Union and among global institutions. However, the Irish people are unique in Europe in that we have a great weapon in fighting incipient tyranny, and that is to go back to our history and draw strength from our past. We have fought worse tyrants than these bullies before, and we chased them out of our country. We are well capable of a repeat performance of the fighting tyranny again. We all fear what may come in the wake of the present restrictions, but it is important that we make our voices heard. Many people claim that we are on the cusp of a new world waiting to be born from the old. But when I look at the forces who promote this, the Chinese Communist Party with its disregard for human life, the European Union with its blather and its deceit and its bureaucracy, the global warming fanatics with their disregard for the welfare of their fellow human beings and their disregard from science, I am filled with foreboding about the nature of this new world. And it may be that this new world will come from the old, and that with all its power and might and its science and technology, it may well fly towards the sun. But I can warn you, if it does not have regard to the old world, to the wisdom of 3,000 years of European civilization, when it flies to the sun like the sons of Icarus, it may come to a very abrupt and terrible end. In regard to world change, I firmly believe that we are on the cusp of a great international movement, a new age of nationalism, populism, and returning power to the people. You can see that in the United States. You can see it in Eastern Europe. You can even see it in some of the major states of the European Union. This country, which has given so much to the cause of liberty worldwide, must ride that international wave and reassert the rights of democracy and freedom against those who seek to impose a heartless and a global tyranny. I ask you to go forth from here with a firm purpose of intention, so that Ireland will have, in the ringing words of Abraham Lincoln, a new dawn of liberty and a new birth of freedom.